Hello and welcome to another episode of Fundy Tidings. I'm your host Jay Remer, and with me today is Matt Abbott. Welcome
Hello.
to the show, Matt.
Hi, Jay. Great to be here.
So Matt is the Fundy Baykeeper, and so today we're going to be discussing the St. Croix River, the Bay of Fundy, and the world at large.
Yes, excellent.
So it's been a while since we've had a chance to meet. So bring me up to speed with what you're up to now and what the Fundy Baykeeper is got on their front burner.
Well, we're engaged in a lot of projects, as you know. Before we started taping, you were reminiscing about interviewing one of my predecessors, Dave Thompson, and so I'm proud to carry on a really powerful legacy, I think, of work that Fundy Baykeeper has done, always in a great deal of collaboration with people in this region. So we've got a number of projects we're working on. I know we'll get into some detail on work to restore the St. Croix River, the Scudic River is its traditional name. We'll go into that in some detail. We're also stepping off, using that as a jumping point. I've just hired someone, a great person based out of Fredericton, who's going to help us look at the health of river herring or Gaspereau populations throughout the whole region to think about how we can take the success on the St. Croix and grow it throughout New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada. So very excited about that. We work a lot on climate change as well. I have a colleague, Louise Comeau, who's our climate and energy campaigner, but we work very closely together because the climate impacts, we see them really strongly in the ocean and right here in the Bay of Fundy, and so we really want to think about the land and policy implications of climate change, but really look at our coastal waters as well. We remain engaged on a whole host of concerns and threats of pollution facing the bay, continue to look at some of the impacts of salmon aquaculture locally also continue to track the various industrial players and what sort of things may be going into our coastal waters from that. And I'd say the key thing, and we also think a lot about marine protected areas and how to take care of our coastal waters, and that's a pretty hot topic locally. There's a range of opinion, but we're really engaged in lots of long-term conversations around how we take care of this place. And I think one of the strengths of this place is that everyone here loves it. We know it's special, right? So where there are differences of opinion around how we move forward, there's never disagreement that this place deserves attention and that we should take good care of it. There's disagreement on how we do that, sometimes really strong disagreement, but that's where I like to function. And we were speaking before we started rolling about how I've been here over a decade now. And this was not, before I landed in St. Andrews as a summer student, I never saw this as my life going forward. But I think the reason I've stuck around is there's so much to chew on in the work we do here. And there's so much opportunity to work together with people that even where there's disagreement, you often find interesting ways to work together as well.
Well, I think that it's a phenomenal concept that that you be in your role. And so before we get into the real specifics, I would like your view on how where we are as a planet moving on, and I'd like to find out how the Bay of Fundy and this particular region fits into the plan and what we can do as citizens to do our bit, and as for instance, particularly in our own houses and in our communities. So that's where I kind of like to take this conversation.
Great. So just this morning, the latest international report by the IPCC was released, and we've seen many dire warnings, and not only dire warnings, but dire warnings that we're seeing come true, right? So this isn't a case of us being warned that climate change will hit us down the road. We're already seeing the extreme storms. We're already seeing species affected by changes in the climate in the ocean. We see that with warming water and acidification. And so we're seeing this play out, and this morning the report was released with an even the starkest warning yet among stark warnings of how serious the situation with global climate change is. Mm-hmm. So we are in a dire situation, but these reports also lay out, what we need to do to deal with that. And a lot of that, it's one of the challenging things about it is a lot of it is above the individual level, right? This is about government policy. This is about global policy. This is about nations making agreements together. This is about people, decision makers, putting the long-term good ahead of the immediate good. Mm-hmm. And that's hard when, even in democracies, we have, often 4 years, shorter or longer election cycles. And so we need to have people whose personal interests are short-term make decisions for the long-term interest. And I think that's how we've gotten into the situation we're in. But at the same time, there is a great deal that can happen. So I've already mentioned my colleague, I think, Louise Camon, our climate and energy campaigner. She's done a lot of thinking. She's been on the climate change file for decades, and she's done a lot of thinking around how we move forward. So there are real recommendations that are there before our provincial government, before our federal government, to take things in a better direction and to make hard decisions now that will lead to a better future and will lead to easier decisions down the road. So globally, and we're seeing the impacts, and we really need to always remember that the impacts are often felt the strongest on those with the least, mm-hmm. right? So those in our own communities, but also on our planet, the people who are already suffering the most often feel the effects of climate change the worst, be that from food shortages, be that from extreme storms without infrastructure to protect them, be that from extreme heat, even in Europe, even in wealthy countries, and even in Canada and BC, we see the impacts on seniors and the vulnerable of extreme heat, right? We see people die from climate change. And we're seeing that now. That's not down the road. We're past the time of future projections. We're living this. This is our story right now. And so bringing that in a bit more local, before I talk about the impacts on the Bay of Fundy, I think it's important to understand the Bay of Fundy a bit. And so I think both you and I know that the Bay of Fundy is a really, really special place. I said that this is not how I foresaw my life. I grew up in Northern Ontario. I was studying political science, and I was at Renaissance College, and I came here as a summer student. And working, I'd always been engaged on environmental issues, knew I would work on environmental issues. But once I landed here, I got out on the water, I was along the coastline, and I realized this is a place where you can spend some time. It will never stop being interesting here, right? There's always more to learn. And that's because the Bay of Fundy is a really special place. Where we live, what we often refer to as the Quaddy region. So if you imagine a line from Point Lepreau over to Grand Manan, the far side of Grand Manan over to the Maine coast, we call that the Quaddy region. And we've got these nutrient-rich tides running into this area with an up and down sea bottom, mountains and valleys on the seafloor. This tide's whipping around islands, so all these nutrients are being forced up and down through the water column. You get nutrients into sunlight, you grow plants in the water, the small, tiny floating plants. Get little plants, gives you little animals give you big animals. So we have animals like whales eating some of the smallest species, and those little species are eaten by fish, which are eaten by bigger fish, which are eaten by seals and porpoise. So this region, the Quaddy region, my colleagues before me would refer to it as the cafeteria of the Bay of Fundy, or the cafeteria of the Gulf of Maine. Because it's been that. We've seen historically 5 species of whales come here to eat, and in some cases breed and nurse their young. We see all sorts of species migrating in and out. And that's because this is such a productive region, and it's because of those tides.
So let me just ask a quick question. Is there a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, that indicates, or perhaps a series of canaries who warn us when things are going south?
Yes. Yes, there always are. And I think the thing we need to understand is the ocean as it is now is not currently at its most abundant or most diverse either, right? We could almost think of cod as one of those canaries. And we've already seen major declines in cod, right? Previous to the heavy impacts of climate change. And that was from other kinds of human activity. So I'd say one of the canaries we would see now is actually lobster. Lobster are in more abundant numbers than they have been in before, in many ways sustaining our fisheries and our coastal communities, which rely so heavily on fisheries. And in part, that's because our system's already partially out of balance. We have so many lobster because we've seen major declines in the predators of lobster, like cod and pollock and other groundfish that eat especially juvenile lobster. And so further south of us in the Gulf of Maine, and the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming water bodies in the world. And I want you to think of the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy as one system, because they are. You can think of the Gulf of Maine as a large bathtub because it's got those sand banks. So it's a bathtub. You can imagine a little kid pushing water in a bathtub. It's sloshing back and forth, and you've got the tide coming in from the ocean, and it's that water sloshing back and forth in the Gulf of Maine with the tide coming in from the ocean that forces itself into the funnel-shaped Bay of Fundy, and that's why we get such extreme tides. So they are one system, and they're one of the fastest warming water bodies in the world. We've had ocean heat waves in 2012 in the Gulf of Maine, and so we're already seeing these impacts. And so further south of us in the Gulf of Maine, we've already seen areas that once had vibrant lobster fisheries. We've seen lobster move north and move deeper to cooler water where they're harder to catch, because the waters that were once perfect for them aren't perfect for them anymore. And we can expect, that's a big risk here in the Bay of Fundy, right, is the loss of, if we get too warm for lobsters' needs, they're going to have to find somewhere else to be. And our economy is really heavily dependent on lobster right now.
I would imagine, however, Matthew, that there's a bigger problem than the economy at play.
Absolutely,
here.
But I like to keep humans in the equation.
Oh yeah, no, I get
absolutely,
that.
But it's much deeper than that. Thank you. It's not often you have to remind an environmentalist to talk about the environment. But I see us as part of the environment, so I say economy just as a stand-in for the impacts that we'll see as well. But it is that balance of the system. So we already see a system out of balance. It's probably 15 years ago now, but long before I was here, maybe even longer, my colleagues put out a report called 200 Years of Ecosystem Change in the Quadi region. So right here, Outer Bay of Fundy. So even before we knew about climate change by all means, but we weren't seeing the impacts as deeply as we are now, figuratively and literally deeply. But already then, my colleagues before me were thinking about, the change we've seen over the past couple hundred years here. Right. Primarily, a lot of the impacts came with the waves of European migrants or migrants from the U.S. The indigenous people had large populations and vibrant societies, cultures, and economies here for a long time and had maintained that balance, but we've seen that impact over the past 200 or 300 years here. And so we have, you sort of bring me to an important point that we have a stressed system. It's already stressed under extreme stress. And so, we talk about the impacts on lobster as a potential canary in the coal mine. Well, lobster are the way they are because they're in an impacted system where they don't have lobster have always been here, but they've often had more predators, right? And so they've been a different balance in the system, whereas we see a lot more of them. We don't see the kind of groundfish numbers we've once seen. There are issues with forage fish, and when we say forage fish, we mean the small fish that everything eats, so herring, sand lance. I'm missing others, but maybe.
Now, I remember, this is a slight diversion, but I can remember when I grew up in the East Coast, and the Hudson River was a big deal.
Yes.
And when I would drive across the George Washington Bridge or however I'd get into the city, you'd always look down at the river and you'd feel sorry for the river because it was so awful. And then over the course of time, actions were taken to improve the pollution, and so fish started coming back, and it's now a vibrant river.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, I understand about the warming of the water being a factor, but is pollution itself a factor in the fish populations, and is that being addressed and improved?
I mean, yes, not to the extent of the Hudson. And with the Hudson, it's interesting, the first waterkeeper organization was Hudson River Keeper. We're Fundy Baykeeper, and they formed to work with others to affect that cleanup that you got to see with your own eyes and that restoration of that river. So yes, pollution is a major impact. We have all sorts of pollution coming from our rivers, be it from pulp mills and other industrial facilities, be it runoff from agriculture. But I'd say like some of the impacts in the Bay of Fundy are less pollution heavy than some of those more populated areas, like around the Hudson River. But the story of the Hudson is one that can inspire us here. And I would say the story of the Penobscot River in Maine is even helps us a little more, because it looks a bit more like the rivers we're restoring here and the coastal environments we're restoring here. So does it make sense if I jump into the Schoodic restoration work now?
Perfect.
So the Schoodic is the traditional name for the St. Croix River, and I'm very, very proud to work closely with the Pescotamakati, the Passamaquoddy Nation, on, we're in the 5th year. We got a big grant from the Government of Canada, Coastal Restoration Fund, to do major restoration work. But this, we've been able to get to that point of this large, significant grant for restoration work because there's been well over a decade of mobilizing to see the St. Croix, the Schoodic River, restored. So historically, the Schoodic River probably had the largest run of something we call river herring. So river herring is a number of species like alewife, called Gaspereau in most of New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada, shad and other species, and they run up the rivers, spawn in rivers like salmon do, and then run back out to sea, and their young come out to sea. And river herring are a forage fish, so they're related to Atlantic herring, sardines, right? Sardines are a certain age of Atlantic herring. And the St. Croix River, the Schoodic, historically probably had the largest population of river herring runs, of alewife. And that's because it has some of the best natural alewife spawning habitat. They like certain kinds of lakes, and that's what we've got here. And so, but because of pollution from pulp mills and other things, because of degradation to the river from the old lumbering days, there's still areas of the Schoodic of the St. Croix River where you find sawdust and wood chips on bottom from running logs down the river, and from all the dams that were first for those for that forestry and running logs, and have since become for power generation and for the woodland pulp mill. We've seen these numbers that would have potentially been as high as 10 million fish running every year historically. The modern low we saw in 2002 was 900 fish.
Oh dear.
So we knew something was wrong, and we know this fish matters a great deal. This fish is eaten by everything, right? My Passamaquoddy friends sometimes call it the fish that feeds all. That's what Chief Akagi will say. And that's a really good way to understand it, because they're not bad smoked, they're bony. I've spoken to throat surgeons who say they've spent a lot of time taking alewife bones out of people's throats, but I like them smoked. But they're eaten by everything. So they're eaten by bigger fish in the rivers, they're eaten by land animals, bears and raccoons and other things. They're eaten by eagles, but they're eaten by porpoise, by seals, by groundfish, the cod and pollock and other groundfish that were so sorely lacking in these ecosystems. And they're eaten by the largest whales as well. They're eaten by humpbacks, among the largest whales. Of course, there's whales bigger than humpbacks. But so these fish really are, we call them a keystone species because they're that keystone to the ecosystem. If species like alewife are doing well, there's a much better shot for other things to do well. And I'll go back to what I said about lobster. As the water gets warmer, they're being potentially pushed out of these more southern regions of the range. Well, alewife run as far south of us as North Carolina.
Oh.
And so they're a good candidate to do okay even in warmer water. So that's why there's so much energy to restore a fish like this, because we're up past 500,000 again. From,
great.
Right? From 20 years ago, we had 900. We've seen work to open fishways to fish. We've seen work, we've had people, the Pescotamakati, Passamaquoddy restoration teams have visited every culvert and bridge in the St. Croix watershed, in the Schoodic watershed. They've assessed them to see if fish can get past them as they should. They've done repairs, they've fixed things, they've planted trees, they've addressed some of the historic impacts on the watershed. And so we're trying to welcome these fish home in the way they deserve, and we're trying to give them a healthy habitat. So we're back up over 500,000. It is not out of the question that in a decade we could see up to 5 million again. Half of that potential historic population, but a lot of fish and a lot of food for everything. And I'll remind you too that they're really linked to groundfish populations. So, and one of the things is the closer into shore, the more available groundfish might be to a whole host of species to eat, but to humans as well. So that's the tie-in to our links. And in terms of, because I do want to see our communities sustained in a healthy way as we treat the environment well. So that means that fish that run into rivers draw their predators into coastal waters. So coastal ecosystems like ours, right? The alewife need to come up the river. So the fish are chasing them. There are stories of people being able to wade into the water and grab pollock by the tail because they were in on a high tide chasing fish into the shallows. And there was even a fishery called the Gaspereau cod fishery, where on the St. John River, where fishers would catch cod who were chasing alewife. So that just gives, and I talk about fisheries a lot because that's how we interact with the ocean. That's often how we know what's down there.
Yeah.
Right? And so these fish are really critical, and it is the source of hope. I have a picture of my daughter, who's now 12, when she was 2, holding a cutout with her friend Wilder, and it was an image of an alewife. And they were on the wharf in St. Stephen because we had boats going up the river symbolically escorting the alewife run, which was around 50,000 fish then. We were calling for the opening of the fishways to the river. That was in 2012. I could not have imagined that 10 years later, as my daughter's reaching her teen years, from a 2-year-old, our chant was "Go Fishies Go," because we had so many 2-year-olds there and we needed a chant that they could actually say. And so we had boats going up the river, people cheering us on from both sides of the river, and this coincided with a sacred run led by the Passamaquoddy Nation, passing a deer antler, running from the community at Sapayak near Eastport all the way to the natural head of tide above Forest City.
Wow.
Not head of tide, but natural end of the alewife run, where they probably finished, where there was a waterfall they may not have passed. They may have, because they're wily little buggers. But so there was all this activity in 2012. Over the next few years, we managed to overturn laws in the states that were blocking the fish. And since then, we've just seen a flurry of activity on both sides of the river. There have been teams in the field assessing the habitat, improving it. And we're actually seeing Milltown Dam come out beginning this summer. So 10 years ago, it was unimaginable that we'd see a dam removal on the St. Croix. And now we're seeing the first dam removal. But it's not just the removal of the first dam. There's assessments happening to improve fish passage at all the other dams on the river. There's really good things happening. So for me, from a perspective of just wanting to see a healthy ecosystem, we focused in on the alewife runs on the St. Croix pretty quickly because, okay, we're seeing a changing ocean. Here's a way we can get food for everything, right? We can support the ecosystem, and we don't know exactly what will eat it, because we may have lobster leaving as the water gets warmer. We may have new species come in, but I'll remind you what I said when I started talking about the Bay of Fundy, is how we have this water rushing in twice a day from the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Maine, and that tide will continue, and that tide will move nutrients from the bottom of the water up into sunlight, where they can grow plants and where those plants can feed animals. So with climate change, we know that the animals that are relying on this incredible cafeteria, incredible system, will probably change. But that's why we need to put our effort into making that system as healthy as possible, so that it can weather that change, so it can withstand that change. And that's why there's that focus on alewife restoration, because there's not anything with a mouth size between puffin and humpback whale. That's pretty big different throat size, right? So anything with throats between puffin and humpback whale is very likely going to really enjoy alewife.
Yeah.
Right?
Matthew, this has just been absolutely enlightening, and you are a great communicator.
Oh, thank you.
So I think people have really gotten a lot of insight into actually what's going on. I would love to have you back, because
Anytime.
I'd like to talk more about the St. Croix River and how we as individuals who live here can interact with it, and how, and we also might get into some different points of view of how we look at water to begin with.
Absolutely, I would love that. And in typical fashion, I spoke so much that we didn't get to the questions around climate change you were asking me at the beginning.
Well,
but
that's
another
okay.
time.
We've got plenty of opportunities to do it again.
Great.
And so thank you very much for coming, and thank you all for watching this episode of Fundy Tidings, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.